Madam President.
The senator from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam President. And the hour is late. I want to thank the presiding officer for being here. I'm glad to be here with my colleagues from New Hampshire and my neighbor from New Mexico. I want to thank the floor staff that's here tonight. And I would like to suggest, this is not the purpose of my speech, but the next time that senators make the suggestion that the floor staff should spend the entire night reading a bill here, that the senators actually read that bill instead of imposing that on the staff that's here. I think that would be a just thing for us to do and the appropriate and proper thing for us to do. Madam President, the last time that we were headed down this road, when Republicans were passing President Trump's 2017 deficit exploding tax cut, it didn't take a mathematical genius to figure out what was about to happen. I told the Senate at that time, as our debt grows, we will spend billions more, not on schools, roads, and innovation, but on interest costs. Worse, we're about to blow another hole in the debt without really helping the middle class. 8 years ago, I said, on top of that, we know that when deficits swell, as they surely will, cuts to Medicaid and Medicare are sure to follow, further burdening working families struggling to make ends meet. Well, here we are. That's exactly the story of this bill. Utterly predictable. This bill, which massively increases our deficit when our children can least afford it. The Republican senators passing this bill tonight or tomorrow morning, if they do, know they're doing it when we have already hit a new milestone for the first time in American history. Our interest payments, Madam President, exceed the amount that we spend on our national defense. For the first time, the American people, because of the irresponsibility in this chamber, are going to pay $1 trillion in interest. That is a massive number. That is essentially the same as what we spend on Medicare, what we spend on children and higher education together, what we spend on housing, bridges, broadband, ports, and highways combined. I want to be very clear tonight that over the years, Democrats and Republicans have pursued policies that have led to that $1 trillion in interest payments. There is no doubt about it. And it's worth thinking about what we could do if we hadn't made such fiscally irresponsible choices. Expand the child tax credit, as my colleague from Georgia said, and cut childhood poverty in half and hunger by a quarter. Build a modern energy grid to meet our expanding energy demands so Americans in cities and rural communities can enjoy affordable, reliable energy at home. Establish a health care system that the American people deserve, a modern system that people in other rich industrialized countries take for granted, a system that does not cost twice as much with worse outcomes, like in the United States of America, the richest country in the world, that forces parents to choose between their children's prescriptions and school supplies, that exhausts the American people who day after day after day have to fight endless negotiations with their insurance companies just to keep their children covered, that constantly threatens rural hospitals and clinics with closure in this country. No other rich country in the world puts up with that craziness. And we're spending twice as much as any other country in the world to get worse health care, worse outcomes, more scarcity. Every senator on this floor might make a different choice about the policies that they would enact, their preferred policies. But I doubt, Madam President, there is anybody here who is willing to go home and defend the virtues of wasting $1 trillion of the American people's money on interest payments. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and outside groups like the Penn Wharton Budget Lab tell us that by the end of the next 10 years, we will have the highest debt ratio ever, eclipsing the debt our nation had in the 1940s. What was happening in the 1940s? That's when the greatest generation had borrowed money to defeat economic misery at home through the New Deal and European fascism by becoming the arsenal of democracy. Those were their receipts. Those were the receipts of a generation that understood its commitment to the next generation, to us. When we contemplate from this broken Senate the patriotic accomplishments of the greatest generation, what has always seemed particularly egregious to me have been the tax policy Republicans have passed 4 times since Ronald Reagan passed it in 1981. Every single time they made the same promises. Every time. Look it up. They made the same promises that their trickle-down tax policy would drive economic growth, cut our deficit, pay for themselves. Every time, including the recent Trump tax cut in 2017, these promises have been false. They've been false. That was 8 years ago. That wasn't a century ago. We know what the math is. Everybody in this room knows the deficit is far worse today than it was when Donald Trump passed those tax cuts. President Trump has had a very rare thing happen, which is he got to take 4 years off and come back and be president. The effect of the tax cuts he passed the last time that he said we're going to pay for themselves clearly have not. There's nobody in this chamber who can deny that. I always find it amazing when I hear these promises, why people make them if they know they're so false, over and over and over again. And I think the reason is, Madam President, that it is a way that politicians in Washington can avoid the objections that you could never get away with at home. Imagine for a minute if there were a mayor in America, any mayor, in any town, in Santa Fe, New Mexico, or in Lyman, Colorado, or in Los Angeles, California. It doesn't matter, Republican town or a Democratic town. Imagine if a mayor came to you, Madam President, and said, this town is going to borrow more money than we have ever borrowed before. That would worry you, that would worry me. And I think our first question would be to that mayor, okay, that worries me. What are you going to spend the money on that you're borrowing? Are you going to spend it on schools? No. Are you going to spend it on parks? No. Are you going to spend it on the water infrastructure that so many communities in New Mexico require? Are you going to spend it on the mental health crisis that our teenagers are facing because of our failure to address it? Are you going to spend it on infrastructure? And the answer to all those questions would be no. What are you going to spend the money on, Mr. Mayor? Well, the answer is I am going to give tax cuts to the 2 richest neighborhoods in town and hope that those trickle down to everybody else. That is the Republican tax policy. There's a reason why no mayor in America has ever done that. There is no mayor in America who has ever pursued trickle-down economics, because you would get run out on a rail. You would get run out on a rail if you went and said, we are going to borrow the most money that has ever been borrowed from our children to finance tax cuts for the richest neighborhoods in town. It makes no sense. It is preposterous. And yet that has been the argument since Ronald Reagan first said these tax cuts will be paid for. The economy will grow. There won't be a deficit. There's a reason we're paying more than $1 trillion in interest today, and that's because our deficits are enormous. Fortunately, and this is really important for the American people to understand, we still live in the strongest country in the world. We are in the world's richest economy. We have the most lethal military. Apart from our president, we have a national commitment to an independent judiciary, the rule of law, and low levels of corruption in our economy and in our society. We have unparalleled capital markets, cutting-edge innovation, and world-leading universities. We have all those things going for us, partly because the folks that came before us invested in those things and built those things and tended those things. But what we struggle with in our time is a sense among most Americans that they can't get ahead, that the American dream is farther and farther out of reach for themselves and for their family. And in my view, that is the biggest challenge our country faces. And in the face of this bill's ill-considered tax cuts to our health care, and in the face of this bill's ill-considered tax cut and cuts to our health care system, which is going to throw millions of people off their health care and make health care more expensive for everybody else. By the way, what's the logic of that? The logic of that is that when you throw people off their health care, they end up going to the emergency room to take care of themselves and take care of their families, just as anybody would. That's the most expensive care that anybody could have. That expense is then put into our insurance, in our insurance policies, and all of us are going to pay more. You can't wish away people just because you throw them off health insurance. When other countries in the world, other wealthy, rich countries in the world have a system of insurance that basically guarantees health care and mental health care to their citizens, it's worth asking why we would throw our people off the not-so-great health insurance that they have. That's a good question. But it's particularly crazy when it just drives up the cost for everybody else. We need to deeply think about the challenges that our country is facing today. It's more unequal. The top 1% owns 30% of our nation's wealth, Madam President, and the bottom 50% owns 2.5%. The top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market. The top 1% of Americans own 50% of the value of the stock market, while the bottom 50% owns just 1% of its value. Something that's really affecting my state is the nation's median home price is now 5 times higher than median family income. And as a result, the average first-time homebuyer is now 38 years old. Madam President, 38 years old versus 29 just a generation ago. Reading scores in our nation have hit a 20-year low. And perhaps most damning and perhaps most upsetting is that our lifespan has declined since the 1980s. We are now, on average, likely to die 6 years shorter than other people that live in wealthy countries around the world. If you're African American, your chance of dying is on average 12 years sooner than people living in the industrialized world. If we don't shift course soon, Madam President, we will be the first generation of Americans whose kids and grandkids will be worse off than we are. That has never happened before. We are on track for that to happen to our children. Many young people today can't afford to live on their own, and they may never be able to afford a house. They can't afford health care or child care. They can't count on a quality education for their children in too many parts of America. Some are really worried about whether they're going to be able to afford a child at all. If you haven't heard a family say that to you in your town halls or in your meetings, you haven't been paying attention. But instead of addressing any of these challenges, we are debating a bill tonight that will make the wealthiest Americans even wealthier and the poorest Americans even poorer, 500,000 of whom live in Colorado, while adding millions more to the debt which working Americans are going to have to pay back. That's what this Republican trickle-down economics comes down to. No matter how you dress it up, that's what it comes down to. Our generation has made some very bad choices when it comes to our children's future. This bill only makes matters worse for them. And all this debt will constrain the choices that they are going to be able to make for themselves. And that's a shame, Madam President, because unlike us, perhaps they will aspire to following in the footsteps of the greatest generation to build a country where lifespans are growing, not falling, where economic mobility is rising, where poverty and economic anxiety are falling, where energy exports are increasing and emissions are decreasing, where quality health care and child care, education, and affordable housing are abundant, not scarce. It seems obvious to me, Madam President, that our child's ambition should be ours as well. Unfortunately, tomorrow, the Republican majority may pass a bill that takes us further in the wrong direction. In its wake and in its wreckage, Americans who do feel an obligation to the next generation are going to have to fight even harder to fulfill our duty. Madam President, I yield the floor.